Welcome back in. We are on to the Sunday night game. So that means we are on to waiver wire for week 16. Thankfully, there wasn't too much happening this week, and hopefully everybody moved on to the next round of the fantasy playoffs. But let's just go ahead and get right into it and not waste anybody's time. And we're going to start off with some of our streaming options at the quarterback position this week. I figure for most people that made it this far, you probably aren't streaming a quarterback, but if you are, I do think these are the options you should be looking at. Aaron Rodgers is at the top. Rodgers had another solid game today, completing 16 of 30 for 289 yards and 3 touchdowns. He also went back in time and ran the ball 6 times for 45 yards and also converted a 2-point conversion for 30 fantasy points against the Jaguars. He's now stacked up back-to-back quality starts and gets a favorable matchup again next week against the Rams, who have surrendered the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So, I mean, Aaron Rodgers, at this point, has been left for dead by most people. But, with Garrett Wilson, with Devontae Adams, Breece Hall, this offense is still talented enough to be able to put up fantasy points. So I do think Aaron Rodgers is a decent option next week against the Rams. Next up, James Winston. Boy, what a terrible game that was for James Winston and the Browns. Winston completed 16 of 25 for 146 and 3 INTs. He was eventually benched for Dorian Thompson-Robinson. However, he didn't fare any better, completing 4 of 9 for 18 yards and another interception. If Winston is the starter next week, he does get a very, very good matchup against the Bengals, who have allowed the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. So we'll have to wait and see if Jameis Winston plays. But if he does, if he's the starter, I do have no problem going back to him in that spot start. And then next up would be the Kirk Cousins. Now, they have yet to play. They play tomorrow night on Monday Night Football. But this is he does get an upcoming matchup against the Giants. Excellent matchup at home. Really like that spot. So I don't mind going to Kirk Cousins if you were to have to. And then Cooper Rush versus the Bucs. Bucs allowed the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Cooper Rush is coming off a strong game against the Panthers, completing 18 of 29 for 214 yards and 3 touchdowns. He has now thrown 2 or more touchdown passes in 3 of his last 4 games. So I think those are the options you'd be looking at there at quarterback this week. Next up for me would be at the running back position. And let's move over there. Now, we had a couple injuries today. One was Nick Chubb, who left the game with a foot injury and did not return. Ford is coming off a strong game where he rushed 7 times for 84 yards and a score and caught both of his targets for 20 yards. He finished with 17 fantasy points and now gets a really good matchup upcoming against the Bengals. I wouldn't be as excited to play him if it's if it's DTR. If it's Jameis Winston under center, I would be really favorable to play Jerome Ford, kind of like an RB2 play for me next week. So if he is sitting out there, because I can see a lot of people have dropped him with Nick Chubb returning, him not really doing a whole lot, I think Jerome Ford is certainly worth a look. Next up is Kendre Miller. Alvin Kamara left in the second half due to a groin injury and did not return. Kendre Miller rushed 9 times for 46 yards. If Kamara is forced to miss their Monday night game against the Packers, I do think Miller would be a decent flex option due to probably just workload alone, because all the other running back option they really have is Jamal Williams. So Kendre Miller could be in line for a really big role next week if Alvin Kamara is forced to miss. And then next up is Tajay Spears. It's been a gross year for Tajay Spears, due in large part because of the injuries and the performance of Tony Pollard. Well, he finally showed so many people why we're excited to get him back this week. While he only rushed 4 times for 5 yards and a score, he exploded in the receiving game for 6 catches on 7 targets for 87 yards and another score for 28 PPR points. The Titans' remaining schedule is actually one where we could see Spears should continue to be involved as they get games against the Colts and the Jaguars to wrap up the fantasy season. So Tajay Spears, if he's sitting out there, I do think is worth a look. And then lastly, you have the handcuffs that we always talk about. I think for me, Ray Davis is obviously that's probably the top option, because if James Cook went down either of the next 2 weeks, Ray Davis would be an incredible play. I think Blake Corum, same situation. If Kyron Williams went down, Blake Corum would be a smash play. Cam Akers, similar situation. A lot of these guys are in that same boat. But for me, it's Ray Davis, Blake Corum, and I think Cam Akers would be the top guys remaining. Khalil Herbert probably would have some appeal, because if Chase Brown were to go down, we've seen how incredible that role could be. So I think Khalil Herbert also falls into that bucket. So let's keep it moving here, and let's move over to the wide receivers. We're going to hit on some guys. First up is going to be Jalen McMillan. McMillan put up another solid game today, catching 5 of 6 targets for 75 yards and a score for 18 PPR points. He's now seen 13 targets and has scored 18 and 21 fantasy points in each of the last 2 games. McMillan should be rostered in all 12 team leagues at this point, and is really a really serious consideration as a flex option each of the next 2 weeks. They get really good matchups over that span. So Jalen McMillan is widely available, and he is somebody that I definitely want to have on my roster. Next up for me is Malik Washington, rostered in 1% of leagues. Jalen Waddle left with a knee injury and did not return, and the Dolphins lost to the Texans on Sunday. In his absence, Washington did see 6 targets and secured 5 of them for 52 yards. The dynamic rookie wide receiver could provide some fantasy flex appeal in the final 2 weeks against the 49ers and the Browns. If Waddle misses time, I do think Malik Washington is definitely somebody we should be taking a look at. It is definitely a viable, waiver ad this week for them. And also remember, Odell Beckham Jr. was cut by them as well, so he is no longer there. So I mean, he really would be somebody that I think that you could look at as a pretty strong, wide receiver 4/wide receiver 5 if Jalen Waddle was forced to miss. Tim Patrick is up next. His role continues to grow over the last 2 games. He's been targeted 15 times over the last 2 games. This week, he was targeted 8 times, catching 4 of them for 30 yards, and he scored for 13 fantasy points. If he's going to continue to be utilized at this rate, he's worth a look in 12-team leagues, and he's becoming a really reliable red zone option, now scoring 3 touchdowns over his last 2 games. Next up is Rashad Bateman. Fresh off their Week 14 bye, the Ravens absolutely rolled the Giants as we expected, 35-14. Bateman was a big beneficiary, catching 3 of 5 targets for 80 yards and a score. He's now scored 7 touchdowns this year. He's also scored double-digit fantasy points in 7 of 14 games, making him a little more game script dependent wide receiver. But in games where they figure to throw the ball, Bateman will be in a wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5 discussion every single week. Jalen Coker returned this week, and he had a pretty solid game. First game back since week 10. He caught 6. He was targeted 6 times. He turned that into 110 yards and a score for 21 PPR points. With Bryce Young playing so much better, Coker will get a favorable matchup against the Cardinals and Bucks to close out the season. Coker is worth a roster spot in 12-team leagues and above. And then after that, we have guys like Parker Washington, who's going to continue to be at least a decent option moving forward, just because there's really not a lot of other pass catchers there in that offense. Obviously, Brian Thomas had a monster game today. Britton Strange, we'll talk about in a second over at the tight ends. But, I mean, he is somebody that's going to continue to see volume. And their upcoming schedule is actually really solid for the Jaguars. They get the Raiders next. So really like that spot. Demario Douglas, somebody we keep talking about as a PPR-only option. But he is, Mac Jones, one of his favorite targets. So or Mac Jones. Drake May is one of his favorite targets. So you can look there. Hollywood Brown, I put him on here. They did activate him from his 21-day practice window, so he's going to continue to practice. He has a shot of playing on Saturday. I think it's a better shot he plays on the Wednesday game on Christmas Day. But I put him on here. Like, I don't think he has that much fantasy upside. I don't know how much he'd even be involved whenever he does get a chance to finally play. Maybe he does play this weekend. We'll see. But just with this, I think they're going to try to get the rust knocked off of him and really just get him through until they get to the playoffs and then unleash him there. So he is worth a look in super deep leagues, but I think in like 12-team and below, I wouldn't be that concerned with picking up Hollywood Brown. And then you just have your other cast of characters that we can always take a look at in deeper formats. Let's move over to the tight end position, and we definitely have some names to talk about here. Patty Fry continues to be an option here. They do get a matchup next week against the Ravens, a matchup they're figuring to have to throw the ball again. They lost today against the Eagles, but Patty Fry scored a touchdown today, so I don't mind him as a streaming option. Britton Strange. Penn State, great. Britton Strange today had himself a game, only rostered in 2% of leagues. It's kind of an Evan Ingram type game where he had 11 catches for 73 yards on 12 targets for 23.8 PPR points. He is the clear safety valve for Mac Jones. While I wouldn't expect this type of opportunity every week, Strange should be the second or third in the pecking order for targets. Next up for Strange is a juicy matchup against the Raiders, who have allowed the third most PPR points to tight ends. So I do like taking a shot on Britton Strange. I think he really sets up nicely. Could be like a borderline top 12 tight end next week in week 16. And then Stone Smart, this really depends on the availability of Will Dissly. But with a short turnaround, Smart figures to be a decent bet to start against the Broncos. Smart finished week 15 with 5 catches on 6 targets for 50 yards in that game against the Bucks. So I do think Stone Smart is definitely worth an ad as well. And a pretty critical game against the Chargers against the Broncos on Thursday night. Now I put Ben Sinnott on here. Zach Ertz actually left the game with a concussion. And if people aren't familiar with Ben Sinnott, they use a second-round pick on him. Super athletic tight end. And so I think there's some appeal here. Really big game upcoming against the Eagles this week. And so I do think Ben Sinnott is at least worth a look in deeper formats because if Zach Ertz is forced to miss. Because I do think Ben Sinnott is definitely a player. He was one of those kind of sleeper type options heading into this year. But like I said, super athletic tight end. And if Zach Ertz is forced to miss, and especially they don't have Noah Brown, so that they're really missing a lot of key pieces here. No Austin Eckler. They're definitely going to be utilizing the tight end. So Ben Sinnott, I definitely think is a very interesting ad. And then I put Chigakonkwo. Had a pretty big day today, but I don't know how much I trust it moving forward. But he's certainly worth a look, as bad as tight end has been this year. So Chigakonkwo would be the other option. So that being said, that wraps up pretty much everybody that I wanted to hit on this week. I didn't feel like we needed to go super in depth because it is week 16 at this point. I don't think many playoff teams are really needing to stream that much. We don't really look to stash outside of the running back position. So, that's about it. So we'll be back again tomorrow or on Tuesday, for your defense, kicker options, streaming options for the week on those ones as well. So keep it locked in here, back in with more content. Appreciate all the support this year. Let's win another week. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.